OCD is in a subpart of the caudate nucleus. By averaging your data over the whole caudate nucleus, you could miss something. So the other way that this type of brain data is analyzed is, instead of a priori picking certain parts of the brain, you basically take all the brains, mush them into one brain space for the OCD group, do the same thing for the healthy controls, and then you ask, is there any part of the brain that's different between those two groups? And that's called a voxel-wise analysis. Obviously, you have to correct for all the comparisons that you make. But we also did that, and I just want to show you. This is actually, they're called K1 maps, but don't worry about that, which is, these are different slices through the brain with different orientations, sideways, straight on, from the top. And these are 3 different slices at the same level for control subjects, all mushed into the same space. These are 3 slices for OCD subjects, all mushed into the same space. And these are the corresponding MRI slices through the brain. And again, what you can see is beautiful detail of the brain, the cerebellum, the brainstem, the cortex. You can see beautiful delineation of the brain structures here with the skull. You see the white skull around the side? Whereas this shows you that the PET scan really gives you fuzzy data. These are K1 maps, which means this is just showing you that the tracer went to all parts of the brain. And that's obviously important, because if you had a tracer that skipped some brain regions, you could get results or not get results because your tracer didn't go where it was supposed to. So this is just showing you that the tracer went everywhere. But when you do that mathematical modeling, because again, what we're interested in is not non-specific binding of the serotonin transporter compound. But of the McNeil compound. The McNeil compound can just sort of stick to parts of the brain, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in its specific binding to the serotonin transporter, and that's what all that gobbledygook math slide was, which was the quantification of the specific binding. And when you do that and redo these maps, that's the specific binding. So the orange places are where there was specific binding of the serotonin transporter. Again, these are the exact same slices I just showed you, but now this is the specific binding with this tracer. And from way back here, it's hard to tell, but what you're seeing is the really bright places are binding in the caudate putamen and also the raphe nucleus, which is where the serotonin cells are made in the brain. What you can see is, look at how black it is up in the cortex, right? Meaning no binding. Although that's, again, we do think that there is serotonin transporter in the cortex. We know that. It's just that this compound can't detect it at the low level that it is. This compound can only detect a certain amount of serotonin transporter if it's available. So when we did this voxel-wise analysis, we found no difference between OCD patients and controls in any part of the brain that we looked at. Okay, so then we thought, well, maybe it's a severity issue. We had a range of severity in the OCD patients we studied. Maybe we're only going to find an abnormality in OCD patients who have really severe symptoms. So to ask that question, you basically do a plot like this, where you, on one scale, we put the Y-box scale. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but that's a clinical rating scale for OCD symptoms. 0 is obviously none. It goes up to 40 being the highest. 16 or above is considered clinically significant OCD. And on this axis, we put whatever the outcome measure is. And here I'm just showing you, again, dorsal caudate, and I'm showing you V3 double prime. And basically, that flat line means no correlation. Meaning, if you have high symptoms, you could have a low number. If you have high symptoms, you could have a high number. That there was no relationship between severity and our outcome measure. So here's our conclusion. So the strengths of a study like this, of this particular study, is it was fully quantitative. And that's a buzzword in this literature, and what that means is we subjected our subjects to that arterial line. People do these sort of studies without the arterial line, and obviously it's much nicer for the subjects, and frankly, it's much nicer for me. I get nervous whenever my subjects go through this. I'm always happy when they're done and everything's fine, and everything has been fine, but but if you don't do the arterial line, you can't be fully quantitative. So one of the strengths of the study was that, and the other strength of the study is our doing both analyses, both the region of interest and the voxel-wise analysis. But it's important to know the limitations of a study like this. So one is the very small sample. We could have selected a sample that didn't have these abnormalities, right? So we didn't find anything, but that doesn't mean it isn't out there. It's just we didn't have a sample that had it. And that's important to know what our sample was. It was patients of moderate severity. We could not recruit anyone with really severe OCD to this study. And you can imagine, for a variety of reasons, it's very difficult. Someone who's, but anyway, we couldn't recruit them. They had to be able to tolerate a drug-free period, which also was a certain group of people. And none were known, and I emphasize this, is none were known to be SRI unresponsive. So the reason I bring this out is one could imagine it could go either way, which is one could imagine there could be, for example, we'll get to this later, but only about 50% of patients respond to serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And one of the challenges for researchers is, why is that? Why do only half of the people respond? If serotonin is so important, why do only half of the people respond? And one could imagine a model where only half respond because only half have a certain abnormality that the serotonin reuptake can actually modulate or affect. Okay, so again, I don't want to get too complicated in it because you could argue it either way. But the bottom line of it is we didn't have anyone in our sample who was SRI unresponsive, and it's possible maybe that's where the abnormality is. And then finally, this issue of we can't look at the cortex other than the anterior cingulate, so we can't say anything about the orbital frontal cortex. Maybe it's all there. But we concluded there was no marked alteration of the serotonin transporter availability in OCD in striatal regions or limbic regions, the thalamus or the midbrain, and there was no relationship between OCD severity and this transporter availability in any of those regions. This is a slide to... Sorry.
Ask questions now or no? No, man.
When I'm done, I have a few next question. Is that
now,
why don't we wait until she finishes?
I just want to acknowledge, meaning I'm the person from the Anxiety Disorders Clinic who did this, so I don't have a picture of me because I'm standing here, but I want to acknowledge, to do a study like this requires incredible collaboration from a lot of very special experts, and this is the Division of Functional Brain Mapping who brought in all this brain imaging technology expertise, and I want to acknowledge them, and I also want to acknowledge NIMH and the OC Foundation. The National OC Foundation was really the people who gave us our first pilot funds to start this study. And with that pilot funds, we were able to say to NIMH, look, we were able to run a couple subjects and then say to NIH, can you now please fund us the rest of the way? Because these studies are, it's about somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a subject to run one of these subjects. And so thanks to the OC Foundation, though, it's that pilot funding that becomes so critical for research like this, because NIMH generally will not fund you unless you can show something promising. And so the small pilot funds like that have such a critical impact on studies like this. Exploratory studies like this. And then I also want to give special acknowledgement to the subjects who participated, again, because they really were our co-participants in something that did put them at some risk. So, with Pett and McNeil, there were no marked differences in SERT availability in subcortical and limbic regions in untreated subjects with moderate OCD severity. Now, we still need to look at the cortex. There currently is not yet a ligand that can look at the serotonin transporter in the cortex, but they're working on it. Mark Thorwell's group is working on it, as are other groups. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize is that you shouldn't walk out of here thinking, serotonin has nothing to do with OCD. It might not have something to do with OCD. I would say the bias of the field is it probably doesn't have something to do with OCD, but that isn't what our study showed. Altered serotonin neurotransmission could still be present, for example, because of abnormalities in serotonin release or those postsynaptic serotonin receptors. So again, we just looked at one part of that complicated serotonin synapse and found no differences. But that doesn't mean there aren't differences in other parts of that synapse that could lead to problems in serotonin communication in OCD patients. And so we feel that it's still important to investigate other aspects of the serotonin system before putting the nail on the coffin of serotonin and OCD. And in particular, the next step, you can't yet look at how much serotonin is released by a cell, but you can look at the serotonin receptors. So this is an advertisement. That's the study we're doing now, which is imaging serotonin receptors in subjects with OCD. And the object is to compare the availability of two different serotonin receptors. Remember, I told you that there were different receptors, and they're located in different parts of the brain. And we're looking at the 5-HT2A and 5-HT1A in the brains of OCD patients versus healthy controls. And again, the procedure is identical to what I described to you, which is It's coming to the Presbyterian Hospital. It's a day of a PET scan. It's a longer day because now we're looking at two things, two receptors, but it's still all in one day. So day one is the PET scan with two of these investigational radioactive compounds. Remember the risks, arterial line, and exposure to radiation. And day two is the MRI scan. So that's the study. Obviously, you're evaluated at no cost. Patients who complete the study are paid $400 to thank them for their time and effort. And if you want it, there's 2 months of open treatment at the Anxiety Disorders Clinic. That's not a requirement, it's if you want it. And the eligibility requirements are very much the same. You can't be too old, you can't be too young, you can't be pregnant, you can't have a lot of other stuff, and you need to be, other psychiatric diagnoses, and you need to be medically healthy. And if anyone were interested, or knew people who were interested, you should call the Anxiety Disorders Clinic and schedule a screening, which can be done by phone. But then I just want to conclude. Oops. I turned it off. Sorry. Conclusions. So, the big picture is the current neuroanatomical model is malfunctioning of a brain circuit that includes the orbital frontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus, and maybe the anterior cingulate cortex, although there's some data to suggest that the anterior cingulate cortex gets lit up whenever anyone gets anxious for any reason, so that's thought to be more non-specific, although that's debated. And the current neurochemical model, we're really, I would say, glutamate and serotonin are still sort of up there, or some interaction between the glutamatergic projection cells from the orbital frontal cortex and the serotonin cells in the basal ganglia. That's still sort of out there. But also, dopamine is still sort of somewhere in the background. And I leave by saying, again, to remember, when you look at this stuff or when people come and talk to you about this stuff, there may be more than one way the brain can produce symptoms of OCD.
Do you want to take questions now?
I'm happy to take questions. What the current working model for how serotonin reuptake inhibitors work is that they do effectively modulate some brain pathway that's not functioning well. And in about 50% of people, they actually do an okay job of modulating that brain pathway. But that's not the same thing as that the primary problem is a deficit of serotonin. So what I would say is that serotonin is very important in the treatment of OCD, and it is the only FDA-approved medications for OCD, and it's frankly, between that and cognitive behavioral therapy, that's it. So do not move away from that in the treatment of OCD. Really what this is challenging us to do is to think in a more complicated way, I think, about what's the underlying problem. And if we really knew if we really had a really complex model of the underlying problem, could we actually then find treatments that work for 100% of people as opposed to for 50% of people? So again, my data don't suggest that serotonin isn't the problem. That's why we're going to study the serotonin receptors. We feel like before just moving on, there's a tendency sometimes in psychiatry to move on to the next faddish chemical. So glutamate is the fad, and glutamate is used, right now it's the fad in schizophrenia, it's the fad in ADHD, and it's become the sort of, But the reality of it is these brain circuits are very complex. They have multiple brain cells in them. Those brain cells use multiple chemicals, and that it actually may be more about the interaction and the balance. Does that?
Also, norepinephrine, the two other things they talk about a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So again, I want to emphasize that serotonin is modulation of serotonin is the only thing we currently have for the treatment of OCD. But again, that doesn't mean that a deficit in serotonin is the underlying cause of OCD. And it's just holding those two things separate in your mind. But until we know something other to use, there's no reason to move off. Now, it is true that the brain imaging data is causing, there's a lot of excitement in clinical trials to try to go study glutamate drugs. Now, studying glutamate drugs, though, is not so easy. Glutamate is an important neurochemical in your brain that is involved in all sorts of things, including memory. So you want to be a little careful when you go mucking around with glutamate, would be my sense. I think it's other people's sense as well. So, yes, the data like this is causing people to try to think more broadly. We've been so stuck on serotonin to thinking more broadly, are there other things we could do? But again,
But they don't have any at this stage. I mean, 10, 15 years, they're not further along with the medicine and stuff like that. There's too many questions and stuff like that. I mean, this has been since 1990, whatever, since
Since
there should be more
Prozac and
conclusions.
clomipramine, right?
Yeah.
There should be more conclusions in terms of the brain data, or more conclusions in terms of how to medication.
Medication-wise.
Well, we can talk about that when we get to the medication thing. I think it's a complicated thing. I think one is that, and this is not. I'm giving you opinion here. I'm not giving you fact, which is, OCD isn't a big moneymaker for the pharmaceutical companies. And unfortunately, I think that does influence where they spend their money. Now, they're happy to make new drugs for schizophrenia and new drugs for depression, and gosh, they're working hard on new drugs for Alzheimer's disease because they could make a bundle on those drugs. If they come up with a medication that parenthetically we can find a use for an OCD, it's not that they would be unhappy about that. It's just that they're not knocking on our door saying, will you do an OCD study? They're knocking on our door to say depression, social phobia, sort of disorders where there's a higher prevalence and where they think they can make more money. So it's sort of, again, that's sort of I don't mean it as a cynical thing, but I think that does unfortunately hurt disorders like this that are of lower.
So the last thing I'd say is what I find is behavior therapy has become that much more important.
Well, I'm going to talk about that in the next talk.
5-minute break.
Okay. Oh, it is. Do you want to? I'm happy.
I'm
Yes,
sorry.
I just had one question.
I mean, people can get up and move and talk. Meaning, I'm happy to sit and.
All right,
Okay.
seems to me that if you're looking for the underlying mechanism for this, it would make sense to try to find out what the similarities are in the causes, because if you're looking at everything from genetics to strep infection to autoimmune reactions, I wonder if there are similarities in what those things do to the brain.
Absolutely.
That might be.
So in fact, the model of PANDAS, which you guys probably are aware of, which is kids who get acute onset OCD, so they get strep A infections, let's say they don't get treated. Historically, we've known they go on to get, let's say, rheumatic fever or scarlet fever or Sydenham's chorea, which is a neurological disorder. Well, lo and behold, when you study those kids carefully, a fair number of them also go on to get OCD. And so there's a whole model by a group at NIH who are studying this. Henrietta Letter, Sue Sweeto, those are Judy Rappaport, those are the people who have been doing that. And the model is sort of borrowing from the Sydenham's model, which is, it seems like in some kids, they get an autoimmune response to the strep, I don't know if it's the membrane or some protein on the membrane, and that antibody that they make to fight the strep crosses the blood-brain barrier and then actually interacts badly with the membrane in the basal ganglia, generating damage. And the idea of it is that if it hits the putamen part of the basal ganglia, I'm sort of simplifying it, but if it hits the putamen part of the basal ganglia, they're more likely to get the motor symptoms of Sydenham's chorea, a choreiform movement. And if they more get the caudate nucleus, they may be more likely to get OCD symptoms. And in the stroke literature or the car accident literature or stuff like that, again, you can find people who've had strokes specifically in the orbital frontal cortex or the striatum and get new onset OCD. So people are putting those things together. The only caveat I would say is if you got a model in your mind, it's the orbital frontal cortex and the caudate nucleus and the thalamus, and you go looking for evidence to prove it, chances are you're going to find it. So one also has to be a little careful about us not getting too locked into this is it, and not staying open to, as I said, in those brain imaging studies, depending on the study, other areas also lit up in those functional neuroimaging studies. It was not just the orbital frontal cortex, the caudate, and the thalamus. Now other areas might have lit up because they provoke the symptoms in slightly different ways, so there could be good reasons why other areas lit up. But I think one wants to hold this model in one's head, but keep it flexible. Just like you want to hold serotonin in your head, but keep it flexible.
I'd like to take a break because I know a lot of people really want to hear about the medications. I want to make sure we have time for that, and then the other panel that we have afterwards,
Okay.
without keeping people later.
Okay.
So literally 5 minutes, and then we're going to start up right away. And We'll see how we do with questions at the end. Thank you.
Evidence-based, and I'm going to show you or talk to you about what sort of the way I think about if an OCD patient walks into my office, what do you think about giving them, and what do you do if it doesn't work, and what do you do next? And as you move to what you do next, how you move farther and farther and farther away from what we know works and what we don't know, or what we don't know works. That doesn't mean one should never try those experimental things. This is sort of like keeping yourself flexible, again, this sort of idea. What it means is, from my perspective, you should try those experimental things only when you have thoroughly and fully exhausted the things that we know work. And one of the reasons why I'm very happy to talk to both providers and patients about this is I feel very strongly that patients really need to be their best advocate about this. Patients need to know what to do and what not to do for OCD, because you guys are the ones who, when your provider changes, when your insurance changes, when you're in some clinic and you're seeing 3 different doctors, you're the ones who can make sure that you're getting the correct next step. And one way you can do that is by keeping really good records of what you've been on and what you haven't been on in terms of evidence-based treatments. And the other way you can do that is if you're at the place where you're starting to do experimental treatments, you keep very good records about what you've been what you have experimented with, including dose and how long. And again, try to keep yourself very clear about what you're on and what you're not, and why you're on it and why you're not. Okay. Having said all that, so this is pharmacotherapy for OCD. So I'm going to start very simply by saying, this may be very simple to all of you guys, but just to make sure again that everyone comes aboard. Let me get my glasses on. There are different classes of psychiatric drugs, and there are different ways you can divide them up. But the way I'm going to divide them up today is there's a big class called antidepressants. Okay? Not that they're not used for anxiety. Many of them work for anxiety and are extremely good anti-anxiety medications, but they're called antidepressants because they were first used as antidepressants. And there are different classes of antidepressants underneath that which have different mechanisms of action. So they're monoamine oxidase inhibitors, tricyclic antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are the things that we're going to talk about a lot today. And then I put other, because there are also other types of antidepressant with different types of action, such as Wellbutrin. In addition to antidepressants, they're antipsychotics. And again, why am I calling them antipsychotics? Why are they known as that? Because they were first used to treat psychosis. But they are used in many other conditions as well. And as psychiatrists, we often lump them into first versus second generation. And what that means is first generation were the things that have been around since the 50s, Haldol, Thorazine, stuff like that. Second generation really start with clozapine or Clozaril and move down to Risperdal or Risperidone, olanzapine, Zyprexa. And I'll get into this in a second. Then there's the benzodiazepines, things like Valium, Ativan, Klonopin, and other anxiolytic drugs, which are really targeted or developed for anti-anxiety medications like Buspar or Buspirone. Then there are things like mood stabilizers, like lithium. Recently, what's sort of hot are things like Depakote, Lamictal, Topamax, stuff like that. And then I put another category, and I've just put as an example there psychostimulants like Dexedrine, something like that for ADHD or something like that. So this, if you will, is sort of an overview of different classes of medications that we have in the armamentarium of psychiatric drugs. Well, what do we use mostly in OCD? Well, obviously we use the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and we use one tricyclic, which is called clomipramine or anafranil. And that one tricyclic, unlike all the other tricyclics, has serotonin reuptake inhibition. And that's why clomipramine is actually effective, was in fact found to be the first effective medication for OCD. The only thing that distinguishes clomipramine from the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac is that clomipramine also has a metabolite that has some norepinephrine reuptake inhibition. And it is chemically a tricyclic, but it is different from all the other tricyclics, okay? So we use selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, clomipramine, and then I'm going to talk about, that's really it. That's the first line therapy for OCD, okay? I'm going to talk about the conundrum of what to do with Effexor, and I'm going to talk then about what do you do for augmentation. And when we get to augmentation treatments, and what augmentation means is you're on one of these first line treatments, but you still have symptoms, which is most OCD patients. I'll talk about that. That's not the exception. I mean, that's not the exception, that's the rule, unfortunately. How do you augment your serotonin reuptake inhibitor? What are reasonable strategies? And strategies people have tested and tried are things like antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, mood stabilizers, and others. Okay. So, first-line treatments for OCD. There are two. One is pharmacotherapy, and now I'm going to call serotonin reuptake inhibitors SRIs to include the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that you know, fluoxetine, which is Prozac, fluvoxamine, which is Luvox. All medications have a generic name, and a company who makes it gives it their own name, and that's why these medications have two names. Fluoxetine is Prozac, fluvoxamine is Luvox, paroxetine is Paxil, sertraline is Zoloft, citalopram is Celexa. Citalopram now also comes out in a Lexapro version of it itself. And clomipramine, or anafranil. So all of these I'm going to call serotonin reuptake inhibitors because that is their main action. And the serotonin reuptake inhibition is what inhibits that vacuum cleaner on the serotonin cell. Okay? What's the other first-line treatment for OCD? The other first-line treatment for OCD is cognitive behavioral therapy consisting of exposure and response prevention. We call it ritual prevention, a la NFOA, or EXRP. And a recent study that we completed in our clinic comparing clomipramine, which some people argue is the most effective medication for OCD, to an intensive version of EXRP, demonstrated that EXRP and clomipramine were both better than if you gave people a sugar pill. But EXRP was superior to clomipramine. So that's one of the things that even though I was asked today to talk about medication, and I'm a psychiatrist, ironically you have up here a behavior therapist who saw with her own eyes how incredibly effective this treatment is. And one of the things I'm going to say to you is that if your patients have not done well on this, or have partially responded to this, it is your obligation to make sure that they get that and get that delivered effectively and well, I think, before you go off into the experimental zone of other medications. Anafranil. Clomipramine, if you get confused with the names, I wrote mostly the generic names, but if you get confused as you go along like that, just ask me, and I should have written both of them. Okay. But I was asked to talk about medication, so I'm going to talk about medication. I'm going to slip in a few CBT slides every here and there, but okay. Okay, so serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SRIs, include the selective ones, and there I've put the generic and the company's name side by side, as well as clomipramine, which is a tricyclic with SRI action, also known as anafranil. So you start with the SSRIs, and you start with the SSRIs because they have the least side effects. Okay, we're going to get to in a second. There's some data to suggest that clomipramine may be more effective than the SSRIs. The data is very controversial because clomipramine was also the first study. So the first studies of clomipramine look like they get really good results, but those were also, if you will, in the cleanest population of patients. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when Prozac came out, and Prozac was studied in OCD patients, some of those OCD patients may have failed clomipramine, but could have gone into the Prozac study. Does that make sense to you? So even though there's some data out there, alternatively, clomipramine is also, if you will, a messier drug than the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so there may be something to it. So we don't know really what's the true story, but the bottom line of it is because clomipramine has more side effects, you start with the SSRIs, okay? Typical doses and time to response, very important. For reasons we don't understand, although there are models for why it is, antidepressant or SSRIs and OCD require higher doses and longer times to be able to see whether they're effective. So for example, Prozac, you would go, we wouldn't consider you as having an inadequate trial of Prozac until you had tried at least 60 milligrams a day for at least 10 weeks. So antidepressant reactions may occur within 2 to 4 weeks. For reasons that are not well understood, the SSRIs take 6 to 10 weeks before they kick in. And I'll give you an example. I had a patient who was terrible contamination phobic, who dressed all in white. You probably know why he dressed all in white, so you could see any dirt on his clothes. And at about 4 weeks of Prozac, he'd been on, I should emphasize, 6 to 10 weeks at a dose of 60 milligrams. Not, I started on Prozac 6 to 10 weeks ago, but I've only been on 60 milligrams for the last 2 weeks. It's 60 milligrams for 6 to 10 weeks. Okay. So he's at about 4 weeks, 60 milligrams of Prozac, and he comes to my office and he says, Doc, I don't think this is doing anything for me. And what I noticed, it's the first time I've ever seen him in yellow pants. I've never seen him in colored pants, ever. I mean, I've seen this man for 6 months. I've never seen him in colored pants. So I asked him, why has he got colored pants on? And he said, I don't know,